Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the One World Trust webinar from the Fringe, the AI Fringe. Today, we'll be trying to unpack what the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park last week was all about, what worked, what did not work or was not attempted, and where all this is heading. With us to do the unpacking today, I'm delighted to welcome three expert panelists, namely Professor Robert Trager, co-director of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative at the University of Oxford and international governance lead for the Centre of the Governance of AI. Also, Dr. Florian Ostmann, head of AI governance and regulatory innovation with the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute. And Lee Sharkey, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Apollo Research, a new Eval's research organization, which provided some Bletchley Park day one input. Before we start, it's perhaps worth spelling out that the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park was primarily focused on frontier models, though there was some discussion of other safety issues. And frontier models are highly capable general-purpose AI models that can perform a wide variety of tasks and match or exceed the capabilities present in today's most advanced models. And the reason for the focus on frontier models is that great strides have recently been made in such models, but there has not been sufficient coordinated focus on their safety aspects up to now. So on to the first question. I would like to ask you what you consider be the main successes of the AI Safety Summit. Tell me what you found most significant and why, and what positive outcomes you would not expected. So, Robert, what are your thoughts on the main successes?
Hi, Robert. Thanks, first of all, for having us. Glad to talk about this just a little while on now from the summit. So I think I would point to four principal successes of the summit. The first is really generating consensus, which I think has been really quite a significant change vis-a-vis where we were even 6 months ago, where I think, there's certainly so many things we don't have consensus about, but when it comes to at least appreciating the possibility, the existence of risks to security from frontier AI, I think that's something that that many have come to believe now, and are thinking about. So it really has shifted the discourse and put this class of risk alongside other classes of risks that are also important and which I think are accepted by a wide variety of actors. Second thing that it's done is the AI Safety Institutes, now one in the UK and one also in the United States. That really is something that the UK did. It created a frontier AI task force. This was a world-leading institution, brought together an extraordinary array of talent from around the world to study these issues, and that it seems will transform into the UK AI Safety Institute. And so I think that the UK really deserves a lot of credit for having done that. And I think it will play an important role, particularly in the AI standards processes, because there's a sort of work that it can do with national security communities that really the other standardizing processes in the world will have trouble with. Third contribution of the summit is to invite China. That was controversial both in the UK and among some other actors, but the UK decided to do it, and I think that's probably a very good thing because it provides really a needed forum. There are some other fora that we have, like the G7, that exclude China, where AI governance is being discussed, but not just from the point of view of China having been there at this summit, but from the point of view of the ongoing summits, both in Korea and in France, and perhaps continuing on after that, to have a forum where the major frontier AI countries can all discuss these issues seems to be important. And I think the UK, again, it deserves real credit because it overcame some resistance to get that done. And finally, a fourth contribution of the summit is the creation of the scientific panel led by Yoshua Bengio that is a bit modeled, I think, on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's just a much needed opportunity to achieve scientific consensus. And I think a key there will be that it doesn't take quite as long to produce reports as the original IPCC does. But I think Bengio is well aware of the urgency. And so I think that was a very good choice and really a much needed step. So those are four areas where I think this has produced really a pretty good outcome.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Florian, what are your thoughts on the main successes?
To make the commitment to work together to establish, this network of international research activities to assess risks and to develop policies or ways of addressing and managing risks. So I think that's sort of a really significant government-to-government commitment. The other, I think, important aspect of commitment was the announcement leading up to the summit, the commitment from sort of leading AI labs and tech companies to participate and support government efforts to evaluate models, frontier models, and to find ways to make models accessible to government, including the researchers that will be working for the new AI Safety Institute. So I think that's also really, really important development. I think in advance of the summit, the week or the 2 weeks leading up to it, there were some really useful and important documents that were published by the UK government on mapping out risks and mapping out processes for managing risks. Those aren't, of course, the full answer to what needs to be done, what should be done. There's a lot more work that needs to happen to make these more concrete, and we might come back to that later in terms of what more needs to happen. But it's a really important step. They're really useful documents, and I think it's really important for those publications to have been issued by government. There's been, of course, important other work from other organizations in this space, but I think it's important for government to be seen to be proactive in that space. And then I think as a last point, and that's maybe the sort of a point that was actually surprising to many, I think, onlookers, is sort of the continuity that seems to be coming out of the summit. The fact that it's not just a one-off event, but there was the agreement that there will be follow-on summits, in 6 months in South Korea and next year in France. And that's really encouraging to see, I think. So one might have expected that it is one big moment with lots of open questions on what will follow that moment, but it seems like there's a fairly concrete plan to follow up and to continue the process, which is great to see.
Absolutely. Right, Lee. I don't know what is left for you, but maybe you can think of something.
I mean, those are both great answers. Like the things that I really think were important here were the commitments, the State of AI report, the announcements of different institutions. I think just to underline all of that, I think one of the really important things that came from the summit was just that it focused the mind of government. It gave them a timeline to get all these announcements out. It, just to focus efforts, and it will continue to do that going forward. I think it's been a real important thing that didn't have to happen. And yeah, that's kind of on top of all the other things as well. Yeah, that's why I like the outcomes of the summit.
Yeah. Right. Thank you all for that. You painted a picture of a lot of positive, significant elements to the summit, which sounds right to me. How about disappointments with the things that you were hoping would be achieved and were not achieved, or things attempted that didn't work? If we went round the other way, Lead, if you got anything that sort of fits in that category?
Yeah, I've got a few. So, as I mentioned, the State of AI report is a great first step. It's modeled on the IPCC, the process by which we hope to get some scientific consensus on climate change. The IPCC has been going on since, that process has been happening since 1988, and you will note that we have not solved climate change. And so this is like a first step in AI, but it is very far from actually, bringing it. It's very far from actually a solution. And so, we shouldn't rest on it too much. It was also somewhat disappointing to hear the UK just before the summit make a firm commitment not to regulate yet. It didn't have to be that way. The UK public supports regulation, and an overwhelming majority of the UK public supports regulation of some sort. And it's encouraging to see that Labour has committed to regulate AI if they become the next government in the UK. Lastly, then, on the voluntary commitments, voluntary commitments are good. It's very encouraging to that the big AI labs have committed to opening up their models prior to release to external evaluators, such as governments, such as Archivals or Apollo Research. But they're only voluntary, and we really need some regulation with teeth to ensure that they do. They have had voluntary commitments since the vice presidential meeting, a good few months ago. And I'm not aware of anyone who has consistent, access to some of the leading labs yet to be released models. And so I would really want to see these voluntary commitments being enacted very quickly. But yeah, lest they remain just words.
Florian, how do you feel about it? Was anything disappointed you, or you feel missed opportunities?
So I think where my mind is at mostly is around sort of the additional work that needs to be done. So I think in many ways the summit was a really really important starting point. As I mentioned, some of the work that was published is an important reference point, but it's clear that a lot more needs to happen. Of course, as Lee mentioned, commitments need to be put into action and into practice. But also, I think one thing we need in the space, both around understanding and measuring risks, and in terms of understanding and agreeing ways of addressing risks, is a much more concrete agreement on what those practices look like. So what we've seen so far are sort of commitments, and also sort of documents that set out different things that companies should be doing, right? That things like red teaming and responsible capability scaling and so on and so forth. Sharing the risk assessments and so on. But I think it's quite clear that in order for any of these things to be effective, we need much more concrete shared frameworks in terms of how risks are measured, how they are understood, and then also what is being done to address them. So if you take something like red teaming, for example, that's a very sort of a notorious area where, of course, we have an understanding of what red teaming means, but how that is done in practice, there isn't any shared understanding or framework, right? Just how much pressure do you put the system under? How much adversarial testing do you subject it to? When do you stop? what are the kinds of challenges that you subject the system to, and so on and so forth. It won't be enough, for organizations to say we've done red teaming or we've done X, Y, Z. We really need a shared understanding of what are the different aspects of how these things are being done, and to able to, for example, to make these kinds of reports comparable, and to understand whether risks have been effectively addressed. But it also, it goes back to the very starting point of measuring risks and understanding risks, where I think if we don't have, it's one thing to say organizations need to have a framework for measuring risks, but what we need are frameworks that are shared in order to ensure that we can compare what's happening in different organizations.
Are you suggesting that there should be international standards in relation to red teaming?
Yeah, so standards and shared frameworks for best practice. The kinds of standards, and of course that's been a highlight in a lot of the commentary around the AI Safety Summit in terms of what is needed next, and what kind of work should be looked at as part of the new AI safety institutes that are being set up. Yeah, I think we do need standards for doing all of these things, and I think it's important to think about how those standards are being developed, for them to be developed in a sufficiently inclusive way, and also for them to be developed in an international manner, such that we can compare what's happening in different jurisdictions, and we can ultimately have sort of interoperability in terms of the governance regimes that exist in different countries, and hopefully that sort of the network commitment will help in achieving that, as opposed to individual countries developing their own standards that aren't coherent with each other.
Yeah. Finally, Robert, any concerns, disappointments?
Well, I suppose so. I really do think that the UK government deserves a lot of credit for doing what it did. And I think there were some brave choices, including inviting China against the will of some of its closer allies. And I really think it deserves credit for leading the world on these things. I would also say, however, that, I think this represented a moment when a lot of leaders around the world got together and they said, we really need rules to govern this technology. And we don't just need them a little bit, but having these rules could be really important for everyone's future. But they didn't discuss what those rules should be, or think about any processes that could be put in place to create international regimes that would embody and instantiate these rules. And so I think that is strange. And of course, we have the other summits coming up. So we have opportunity in Korea and in France to think about that, and we have other fora also to talk about these things. But I think if we're going to say that rules are so important, well, then probably we want to talk about what those rules should be and how we're going to create an international regime around those rules. So I guess I'm hopeful that we can start to do that at some of these future summits or in the lead up to them. We could have thought about, for instance, some working groups around that would have been, I think, a really positive and hopeful sign. And then I just will underline also what Lee also mentioned, the voluntary nature of what the UK government itself is doing at home, having brought the world together and say how important this is. It's still in the realm of voluntary regulation. And I think regulation or an approach that it's not clear that it really meets the challenge that the government itself has brought to the world's attention. So I'm hopeful that we can move past those things. I think it is interesting what the Labour government is saying and the approach that it's going to take. Although I also think that there is a sort of sense in which governments like to they want to be seen as being very effective when vis-a-vis industry. They want to be seen in that way. They certainly regulatory capture is something they want to resist. On the other hand, being anti-innovation is something that also worries them tremendously, being perceived that way. And so there is this dynamic where they sort of take large positions, but then we really have to watch to see what, in fact, is followed through on. And maybe I'll just mention in that regard, how these safety institutes are going to be funded. How much funding are they really going to get to do all the work that they need to do? It's one thing to have a nice announcement, and the UK, again, to its credit, has done wonderful work with the task force, and certainly this will be an institution that is doing useful things. But again, compared to the potential issues, at least as they were argued at the summit, I think we can ask whether these things will really be resourced. Also in the United States, the Safety Institute there, whether that will really be resourced in the way that we would hope that they would be.
Well, you make some important points there. Just in the point of regulation, and that's what World War Trust we've been pushing for globally to develop global governance and regulation as rapidly as realistically feasible. But if one is aspiring to global governance, a global system, is there not an argument against establishing national regulations that either you all follow the leader, so let's say with GDPR, so you all follow the EU if the EU comes first or whatever. But to the extent that each one does its own thing, then you are creating this mosaic of differences, which do they not make achieving the global governance arguably more difficult?
I think, we often get international standards coming out of the discussion of national standards bodies. Did I say that right? International standards coming out of the discussion of national standards bodies, which I think is a nice way for things to happen. We do get it, as you're suggesting, sometimes in the other way, which sometimes I think is necessary. And I do sort of think that you're onto something there, in that the reticence of some of the national governments to really be as forceful as maybe they need to be means that, and in some cases, prominent cases, the legislatures, it's not clear how effective they're being generally. So I think that those are cases where maybe it really does need to be international leadership that can create the standards and then have them percolate down. But on the other hand, this is a sort of a special space where some of the standards creation has to do with interfacing with national security communities. And that's really something that where states have the expertise. It's not clear that, at the level of the international standards bodies, they have the kind of expertise, for instance, that we would need to create evaluations on whether a model could further the creation of a bioweapon or some other thing that intersects with a national security concern. So I really think we can't get away from the states. They have a role to play. The questions of interoperability, I absolutely agree with you. They're significant. That is a worry, but I think states, unfortunately or fortunately, they have a lot of the expertise here, and we need to rely on them.
Do either of you, Florian, want to come in on that point?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that. So I think, on the one hand, there's an important distinction, of course, between, standards that are of a nature where they are, by default voluntary, and, legally binding measures, regulatory measures or legislative measures. When it comes to binding measures, those can, of course, be either developed at the national level or at the supranational level. We've got, of course, the EU AI Act as a really important example, where by the looks of it, there will be provisions around foundation models in the EU AI Act that will in many ways create a, draw a line in the sand that sort of any other regulation, that's being developed in other jurisdictions will somehow need to relate to or position itself in relation to. And then, there are other, I think you mentioned, Robert, at the beginning, there are other initiatives in the Council of Europe. There is, the work that UNESCO has been doing, which of course that's not directly binding. There is the initiative that the Secretary General in the United Nations has launched, and the Digital Global Compact discussions. A lot of that is still to be seen in terms of whether there's an ambition to create something binding or something that is more in the nature of guidelines or guidance. I think what complicates the picture in thinking about the context of the AI Safety Summit and the issues that were discussed there, and then thinking about rule-making regulatory measures, is that a lot of the debates around AI regulation that are underway, that are alive, predate the sort of the interest in frontier models and even more broadly in foundation models and generative AI. And so the EU AI Act is a case in point where the negotiations for the AI Act, of course, started a long time before generative AI was one of the dominant form of AI on everyone's mind. And the same is reflected in the work that the OECD are doing and others. And so it's important, I think, to think about, so very clearly, recognize that there are specific issues that need to be addressed in the context of frontier AI, but also think about what measures, especially when it comes to regulatory and sort of legally binding measures, what measures should be taken that are coherent and form part of a bigger whole in relation to legislative initiatives and initiatives that are already underway, and then that have this broader focus on sort of AI, frontier and non-frontier alike.
Well, indeed, and that sort of leads on to the third question now is wanting to pose, which so we're sort of starting to get into it, is this question of the way forward, and we've noted that it's Bletchley Park was not just a single event, which it could have been. It's the start of a process with 2 milestones down that pathway. But what is the sense of where it's going to go? Do you see it? Do you see it, finishing in France? Do you see it carrying on separately? For indeed some years on its own sort of pathway in relation to safety, or do you see it sort of coming into the centre, maybe linking with the UN and leading to an overall set of global governance for AI? Lee, do you want to start off on that?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I do think it's definitely going to be an important forward. I think going forward, I'm willing to take that bet. Part of the reason for this is it's related to a point that Robert brought up earlier, where some states are looking to this process and other international processes as ways to regulate the technology that don't result in their particular country falling behind. Especially some of the smaller players, such as, I would hazard a guess at the UK, but I would also say similar things for France and Germany. They don't necessarily want to hamper their domestic players, and are looking to international processes to help level the playing field while regulate the technology, but also just not hamper their domestic players. But I think also it is, I think, a very important thing that it is like at a cadence of about 6 months. That is, for a technology that moves as quickly as AI. That seems pretty important. A year is a very long time in AI, and the conversation will move quicker than a cadence of 1 year could possibly hope to achieve. So I'm very encouraged to see the cadence being set up at 6 months. So yeah, I would bet that it would be an important forum going forward.
Florian, you mentioned Global Digital Compact, and I was at a sort of one-day conference on Wednesday in Brussels, big international conference with high-level speakers, and it sort of finished with a speech by the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. But before he spoke, not one single person had mentioned the Global Digital Compact, although the conference was meant to be about the global governance of AI. So one has to ask, when is the Global Digital Compact going to completely ignore AI, or if it's going to include the AI, how's that going to be achieved? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's too early to tell. I think what to what extent there will be an emphasis on AI. I mean, it's clear from the ambition that's set out that AI will be an important part of the Global Digital Compact. But it's also clear that, of course, the development and of the high-level advisory group that was just set up, that's going to inform the AI-related component of the Global Digital Compact, that comes at a relatively late stage in terms of sort of other international initiatives, the OECD's work that's been going on for several years, UNESCO's work, the Council of Europe. So there is a question, I think, to what extent, how will these pieces fit together? And also the fact that the Global Digital Compact, of course, in scope will be much broader than AI, even though AI is recognized as one important component. It's going to have to address a much wider agenda of, both the governance of digital technologies, but then also, address questions of digital development, for example, which are, I attended a few weeks ago, the Internet Governance Forum in Kyoto, where that was one forum where the Global Digital Compact was a very prominent point of discussion. But a lot of the emphasis in those discussions was on, digital development. And to some extent, there was actually perceived to be a tension between, a focus on AI governance and sort of focus on sort of development-oriented agenda priorities. But all of that to say, I think the Global Digital Compact, it has the ambition of addressing a very wide range of policy issues. And we've got, at the same time, a lot of initiatives underway that are AI specific, of which the AI Safety Summit and the process kickstarted by that with the follow-on summits are the latest addition in the international landscape. And so I think we'll have to see how these pieces fit together.
Robert, what are your thoughts about how the future of the Bletchley Park AI safety process might evolve, and how it might link up with the UN processes?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, the UN has such ambitions now. It says it's going to put out a preliminary report before the end of the year from the high-level advisory body that is just formed. And it says it's going to solve the interoperability problems between the different fora. And I'm not sure how it's exactly going to do that. I think the thing that you really could have imagined the UN calling for is an IPCC, and maybe they still will. But of course, the summit has already set up something similar there. So that'll be interesting. That's happening in the context of the Global Digital Compact that the UN Tech Envoy is sort of managing. I think it's fascinating. I guess I'll just say two things very quickly. One is related to these issues with the Global Digital Compact. I do think there's this framing whereby it's regulation or development. And so regulation is seen as something that would be hampering development. And I think it's fair to see it that way, because often regulation has meant limiting export controls or something like that, restrictions on trade that have these important development impacts. But since this is a dual use technology, I think it really is regulation that we're going to need in order to have broad voice and access. In other words, if we have good regulatory systems broadly in place, then it will be easier to share the technology more broadly and access to the technology more broadly. Things like, let's say, fine-tuning access, or compute and training access. These things, if they're happening within broad regulatory structures, then that will be less of a concern from the dual use perspective. So I really think that we don't have to see these things as so much in tension. They're not, in fact, always so much in tension the way that it's sometimes portrayed. I'll just say that with this, these summits, I think they will carry on, because I think they provide a venue that doesn't exist exactly elsewhere. And so I think that will probably be perceived to be important. But just the fact that a venue carries on isn't necessarily a vote in its favor. We've had the discussions on lethal autonomous weapons in the CCW for over a decade now, and that hasn't produced the sorts of law that advocates were hoping for. So processes really can carry on without producing important effects. Will this process produce important effects? I think, in all honesty, I think a lot of it has to do with ideas. We need some good ideas about how to do international regulation in a way that frontier AI countries will go along with, and also provides broad-based voice and access. And I don't think we have all the solutions right now. So I think our ability to make progress really depends on whether some of those good ideas can be surfaced.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all for that very much. How about if we just talk about one or two specific issues which sort of come up, which are key to all this, the idea of global governance, and one is China, and so you noted the fact that they were there in day one, and there was sort of and that was in the successes and a positive step. But we're all aware that they were not there and were not really invited for day two, and one can understand why, perhaps, that Western AI developers may not be comfortable with sort of deep interrogation by a Chinese AI safety institute, perhaps. I don't know. Equally, concerns, maybe governmental concerns. So, what's your feeling as to how one should approach China and try to deal with this dichotomy? Florian, do you want to go there?
I'll give it a try. I mean, I think obviously, the Chinese government was represented on the first day of the summit, which I think most observers sort of would agree that was an important, an important fact for China to be involved in that way. Not having attended the summit myself, I can't really judge sort of and sort of not having been privy to the discussions happening on the second day. I can't really judge from where I'm standing in terms of the ins and outs of inviting China and the Chinese government to that, to the proceedings on the second day. There is, of course, the issue that, as we've already discussed, I think a lot of the topics in scope of the summit touch on national security related questions, and that will, raise questions about, which countries to include in those conversations and which not to include. But I think, insofar as there was uncertainty at the outset whether China would be involved at all, I think it's positive to see that China was, in attendance on the first day. And in fact, there are other sort of encouraging developments. Some of you may have seen there was a statement that was published in the wake of the summit that was developed, beforehand through a meeting between academic researchers from the West and China, and sort of a consensus statement on the need to address questions in this space, which I think sends an important signal, and again also highlights, I think, the need for this conversation to not only be driven by governments. Of course, as we said earlier, the fact that this was a government-organized summit was really important, and it's important that government-to-government conversation and commitment continues. But it's just as important and indeed important as a complement, especially in areas where government-to-government conversations may be difficult, for other stakeholders to come together, step in, and see where agreement can be achieved.
Yeah. Lee, do you have any thoughts on progressing or helping resolve the China debate?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on international relations on this, but it is very encouraging. As Florian brought up, this joint statement between Chinese scientists and Western scientists on just a shared understanding of the risks. As Florian pointed out, this has been important in the past. It's my understanding that during the Cold War, similar efforts were very useful for bringing the discussion forward between Soviet and US nuclear scientists. So this is it's a nice echo of that process. But yeah, it's ultimately, China need to be involved in AI safety. These are global issues, and yeah, it is just very encouraging that they were invited, despite the international environment that we find ourselves in.
Okay, thank you. And Robert, what are your thoughts on the subject? And perhaps, I don't know, I know you put forward the idea of you and others of jurisdictional certification, which I was wondering whether if you could say a little bit about that, and whether you think that could help create a situation where China could be brought in, and still the West feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, thanks. I do think so. I think that's one approach that we should be thinking about. I would also just say that the fact that China wasn't there on the second day, I think it really shows that the UK had broader ambitions, in fact, than it achieved for that second day. Because in the end, there wasn't anything that came out of the second day that really China couldn't be involved with. There weren't discussions or topics, really, as far as I understand, that couldn't involve China. But so that's, I think, that's something interesting. But in terms of how to think about engaging China, I mean, of course, it's one of the leading countries when it comes to artificial intelligence. So if we really want to govern it on a global level, really needs to be a regime that involves China, unless as you think, as some do, that you can really make a great deal of progress from the point of view of U.S. interests and countries closely allied with the U.S. through export restrictions, and that's sort of enough. If you just prevent the high-end compute, and it's only the really latest generation of compute from being broadly distributed, then maybe that's what we mean by AI governance. And I guess I'm on the side of thinking that isn't it. It may be useful from a certain set of interests, but that probably we need to have more when it comes to a governance regime than that, because there is just so much compute and knowledge already distributed around the world that there are going to be, in fact, lots of places in the world with the ability to do things that we would want to see regulated that will have cross-border effects. So a jurisdictional certification, that's a paper that I wrote about, and along with others. And so I'll just say very quickly, shall I, that's an approach that is similar to what we have in civil aviation or the International Maritime Organization or the Financial Action Task Force. These are international organizations that don't audit firms. So the ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization, isn't auditing British Airways. It's auditing jurisdictions to make sure that those jurisdictions have appropriate regulation. And in some cases, these organizations don't just look at the regulations, they look at whether there's a track record of enforcing these regulations and the capacity to do so. And they've been very successful at increasing safety provision in these other industries. And I think there's some potential for doing something like that here. There's a lot more to be said about it, but I would just say, in response to the China question, that if we're thinking about it that way, then having a regime which has an international component in terms of a minimal set of standards that are agreed on, because not everything should be the subject of international standards. States have disagreements on all kinds of things that are perfectly legitimate, like what should privacy regulation be. But if we consensus on a minimal set of standards, and that's part of an international regime, and the enforcement is left at the local level, but there's still powerful incentives, as there are in other international regimes, to comply with the international regime itself, then I think, and so we're talking about regulating civilian AI. Well, that is really the kind of thing that China can be involved with, and along with other states broadly in the world. And I think it just can be the subject of a broad international debate and regime how we should do that, and in fact can be the subject of broad-based international collaboration. If for instance, one state doesn't have appropriate regulation, just like it is in these other industries, there can be really a quite extraordinary international effort to get the regulatory standards in a particular jurisdiction and the regulatory capacity in a particular jurisdiction up to international standards.
Yeah, very good. Okay, shall we just got a few minutes left, and see if we can answer one or two questions from the audience. First of all, given the huge amount of crises that currently face us, the society, the lack of diversity in leadership and consultation is often a key root cause. Given the makeup of this panel, how do we start making AI design, governance, development, security, risk management, and regulation more representative to society? Yes, that's more a question I fear for us as organizing this panel, and I was challenged by it before, and I just have to apologize that we went for merit and the three excellent people responded. Let me move on to Sarah Clark, who asks, technical governance practitioners are dealing with AI and ML implementation right now. While governance remains voluntary, what are the more proximate risks the panel sees? while we have skilled resource shortages and ongoing lack of consensus on good monitoring, risk management, risk assessment, auditing, oversight. Who would like to have a go at that? Florian, could you have a go at that?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. I mean, is this a question more focused on the sort of, non-frontier AI space potentially?
It's not explicit.
But it is. Okay, yeah. Sarah just added to the chat. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important, it's important to recognize that, and it's something, that we try and to emphasize in our work, and it's started to become important to emphasize it, that I think in the non-frontier AI space, there are lots of, unresolved governance questions, right? And there's just as much of a need to fill in the blanks for best practice and, metrics and agreed ways of doing things in the non-frontier space and in the non-generative AI, non-foundation model space, as there is in the space that's been getting so much attention over the last few months. And I think, one thing that I would like to see coming out of following the summit is sort of a balanced conversation that recognizes the importance of thinking about frontier AI, but also recognizes the importance of these unresolved questions, and in fact the need to think about coming up with frameworks in both areas that are coherent and make sense together and are sort of as a continuum rather than separate categories. I mean, yeah, just to name, I mean, the obvious issues in sort of a non-frontier context, and when it comes to predictive modeling, decision support systems are bias, the lack of interpretability, the difficulty in explaining decisions that are being made with AI, data provenance and data protection issues are relevant in that context just as much as they are in sort of the generative AI context in many cases. So yeah, I think as the question implies, monitoring, risk assessment, transparency are key in that area. It's interesting, I think, to see, maybe that's the note I'll end on, that I think, if you think of solutions at a high level, or sort of, what needs to happen, the same answers more or less apply. If you see what's coming out of the Frontier AI discussion and the AI Safety Summit, the first step is to think about increased transparency, access to information, ability to scrutinize systems. And those are the things that apply to the non-frontier space as well, I would say.
Right, thank you for that. Can we just fit in one more question, which is on a subject that we haven't talked about really, which is rogue actors, malicious actors. So just precisely what is meant by regulation, and how can any such be enforced in respect of malicious actors in rogue jurisdictions? Lee, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, happy to take that one. So by regulation, the others can correct me on this, but I imagine things like laws that enforce know your customer requirements on the users of AI systems, or things like if you want to expose your model to a certain number of users, there are checks that you have to go through to be able to do that. Other regulations, such as perhaps you're not allowed to, while we get familiar with the properties and capabilities of these systems, we might want to take it a bit slow. We might want to say require that the size of frontier AI models are below a certain level, things like this. So that's what regulation, at least in my head, looks like. How can we enforce these in rogue jurisdictions? So it's a good question. Some of them you probably won't be able to, although there is one key governance node that may be useful, in that this is why in the last couple of years, the AI governance discussion has shifted from not really having very much idea of what to do to having at least some of an idea, and that some of an idea is looking at compute governance. So if you focus on the compute that is being used to both train and run frontier AI systems, then you might have some, broad control that extends beyond your borders. For instance, if a model is sufficiently large that it can only run in 5 data centers in the world, and all of them happen to be in the US, this is one way that you might be able to regulate some of the risks. Of course, there is some risk of proliferation of the infrastructure required to both train and run these AI models. That's a harder thing to govern, but not necessarily impossible through things like export controls. It would need to be very well enforced, and it's yet to be seen if that enforcement can be achieved.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm afraid our time is up, so we're going to have to wrap it up. I think what we have established is that at the outset, the number of successes that you listed, I think, were with a good thick list, with the agreement of the safety institutes to be able to pre-assess the new models coming out in 2024 before they are launched. The launch of this new sort of study on the science, coordinated the first time by Yocho Bengio, sort of analogous to the IPCC, the Bletchley Declaration, sort of showing everyone coming together not just in an event, but in the start of a process. It wasn't helped by the UK saying, of course, we're not going to regulate, and everything obviously that was talked about is all voluntary. So there is a long way to go, but it seemed like a good start. And I'd like to thank you all very much for participating. And I would ask if, to be very cheeky, you would just offer one or maybe 2 words that would express your view as to the success or otherwise of Bletchley Park. Robert, how would you describe it?
1 or 2 words. I would say I'm just most hopeful about it being an ongoing process. I think they deserve a lot of credit as a first step, but if it ends there, then it's not a success. But if it does lead to an ongoing process where we can have, I think, the dense discussion of what an international regime would look like, what rules would look like internationally, if the UK continues to support those processes through its AI Safety Institute, which still looks to be a world-leading institution, then I think that would be really quite a badge of honor.
Thank you for that. More than 1 or 2 words, so you have your choice as to how many words you use. Please.
In the spirit of the question, I will say it's still risky.
Still risky. Very good. Thank you. Florian.
I'll also stick to exactly 2 words, which is momentum and commitment. Sort of what we started with earlier. I think we can see both of them, but it's also important. Be interesting to see and important to see those things continue and the commitments to be translated into tangible outcomes.
Very good. Okay, thank you all very much for joining us.